folks around the country are obviously waiting, and hopefully they're out trying to drive the vote when it comes to the midterm elections. We have seen the polling. There are two challenges, it seems to me, to pollsters in anticipating what the results are going to be Tuesday, and frankly, the results may end up not being finalized until well after Tuesday. But the two challenges are, one, getting a notion of who is inspired to come out and vote, right? Because we can get a notion of, like, where people are in favor, but just like the level of determination that people have to go and vote is one of the questions. And then the other one is one which you are an expert on, and is how many people are actually going to be prevented from voting who want to vote. And there's no way for pollsters to get that notion. So we could look at a race, let's say in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams is up on Brian Kemp, or at least in a statistical tie. Maybe she's up by a point, but that's, within the margin of error in the polling. But we also know that Kemp is the Secretary of State and basically the elected official in charge of, according to him, disenfranchising as many people as he possibly can in the state of Georgia. I don't know if you want to start there or you want to start generally, but what are we looking at in terms of voter suppression in this country?
Well, let's start generally, and then we'll go to Georgia. So I would say overall, the big picture is that 24 states, so nearly half the country, have some sort of new restriction on voting in effect for 2018, whether that's a new voter ID law or whether that's a more aggressive purge of the voter rolls or whether that is some sort of other barrier to voter registration or some sort of restriction. Some states have multiple restrictions in place for the first time. And a lot of this stuff is playing out in 2018 because a lot of the close races are in states that have restricted voting rights, whether it's Georgia or North Dakota or Kansas. And then a lot of the races themselves are close in these red states that normally wouldn't be competitive. So normally we wouldn't necessarily be talking about Georgia or North Dakota or Kansas, but these places actually have close races. And then you have the fact that many of the people that are the architects of these policies are in fact running for governor or for higher office themselves and essentially overseeing their own election. So all of this has kind of reached a crisis point in Georgia where you have a bunch of restrictions on voting. You have the guy who's pushed those restrictions running for governor. And then you have the fact that the race itself looks really, really close. So if you're talking about a few thousand voters here or a few thousand voters there that are discouraged from voting or that try to vote but can't, that's enough to potentially swing a close election.
And in Georgia, we're not talking a few thousand voters, are we? We're talking a lot of voters.
It depends how you look because there's a bunch of different categories. So overall, 1.5 million people have been purged from 2011 to 2016. So we don't know how many of them were purged for good reasons. We don't know how many of them were purged for bad reasons, but a lot of people have been purged, so that's one concern. Another concern is that
now, wait, just be clear. What does that mean when they're purged? What does that mean?
Well, we don't know because the state doesn't release a lot of information on why someone's been removed. So it could be that they moved.
So to say purged, it means that their name is literally taken off the voting roll. So when they show up at the polls, they're like, "We don't know who you are."
Well, it could be that they died or they moved or they did something that would make them ineligible. It also could be that the counties got it wrong and people who are lawful residents of Georgia who didn't move or didn't do anything else have been purged as well. So we don't know, but it's a high number. So there's some likelihood that at least some people who shouldn't have been removed have been removed. Then we found out just a few weeks ago that 53,000 people were put on a pending voter registration, meaning they got a letter in the mail saying there is some sort of problem with your registration because the information on their voter registration forms didn't exactly match their information on state databases. These people can still vote at the polls if they have the right ID. But if you got a letter like that in the mail, Sam, saying there was a problem with your registration, you would probably think you weren't eligible to vote. So there's a big concern that those 53,000 people might not turn out. And then if you look at the numbers, 70% of the 53,000 on pending registrations are African American and 80% are people of color. And so there's a hugely disproportionate impact. in an election where Stacey Abrams is trying to become the first black woman governor in U.S. history.
So that's going to be, it's almost, this is the thing. We look at these polls. Is it possible to ever know like how much it's impacting Georgia, or is this something that we're not going to find out until some social scientists come in there and 2 or 3 years later say, boy, without this 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 people purged from the voting rolls or sort of suppressed, Stacey Abrams could have won or would have won by more.
Well, I hope that's not the case. I hope that, for example, that the people on the pending registration list who are actually eligible to vote if they show up in person, I hope they know that they can show up and that their votes will be counted. But there is a lot of concern that a lot of the times we don't know about the full extent of these efforts until way after the election. I wrote a very long story about Wisconsin's voter ID law, and it was only after the election when we did interviews with voters, when we talked to election officials, when the studies came out, that we saw that tens of thousands of people were potentially blocked from the polls. That was not readily apparent on election day. And so the concern is that a lot of these things aren't measured until after, and that there's only a certain percentage of people that show up and try to vote and their votes aren't counted. There's usually a much larger percentage of the population that don't show up at all because they don't believe their votes will count.
All right, let's turn to a story out of North Dakota. Now, it appears that Kramer has sort of pulled away a little bit from Heidi Heitkamp, although who knows, right? For sure. But what we do know is that the plan to disenfranchise a key voting bloc for Heidi Heitkamp has been stunning, it seems to me. And I'm talking about Native Americans and, frankly, students, it seems like, were the targets of a voter ID initiative. And it's not just a simple voter ID. It's something sort of rather sophisticated. Explain that to us.
Yeah, this is really extraordinary. So earlier this month, so right before the election, the Supreme Court upheld a voter ID law from North Dakota. And what that law says is that your ID needs to have a current residential street address, which might not sound like a big deal ordinarily, but North Dakota has a lot of reservations where Native Americans live, and they don't have street addresses because they're so rural. So what that means is that suddenly Native Americans aren't going to be able to vote with their tribal IDs in North Dakota. And that's really important because Heidi Heitkamp only won her first election to the Senate in 2012 by 3,000 votes, and she got 80% support in the 2 counties in the state with the largest Native American reservations. So this absolutely could impact the election if it was close. I think the bigger picture is that this is the most historically disenfranchised community in this nation, given what has gone on in American history. And suddenly the IDs that they use for their entire lives, their tribal IDs, aren't able to be used for voting, simply because they live in rural areas and get their mail at the post office through P.O. boxes. So suddenly the tribal leaders now, days before the election, are having to go around and suddenly give everyone a street address and then print these new forms for them to be able to then give to poll workers to count as a valid ID. We have no idea if they're going to be able to pull this off. We have no idea if the poll workers are going to accept this. The Secretary of State hasn't even said whether these documents will be accepted. But there's this crazy scramble underway in North Dakota now to help people comply with the new law.
Yeah, it's absolutely nuts. Well, look, we got to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about a couple other states. Florida in particular, the outcome of this election in Florida will both be, in some respects, implicated by a voter disenfranchisement project. And the outcome of this election may also implicate the reenfranchisement of up to 1.5 million voters in Florida. We got to take a quick break. We're talking to the great Ari Berman. I'm Sam Seder. We'll be right back on Ring of Fire Radio.